In the old school they use now for the village hall, below the clock that has stood always at 1 minute past 10, hangs a small dusty painting of a horse. He stands, a splendid red bay, with a remarkable white cross emblazoned on his forehead, and with 4 perfectly matched white socks. He looks wistfully out of the picture, his ears pricked forward, his head turned, as if he has just noticed us standing there. To many who glance up at it casually, as they might do when the hall is opened up for parish meetings, for harvest suppers or evening socials, it is merely a tarnished old oil painting of some unknown horse by a competent but anonymous artist. To them, the picture is so familiar that it commands little attention. But those who look more closely will see, written in fading black copperplate writing across the bottom of the bronze frame, Joey, painted by Captain James Nichols, autumn 1914.
Fading away like the stars in the morning, losing their light in the glorious sun. Thus shall we pass from this earth and its toiling, only remembered for what we have done. Only remembered, only remembered, only remembered for what we have done. Thus shall we pass from this earth and its toiling, only remembered for what we have done. Ladies and gentlemen, the author of War Horse, Michael Morpurgo.
And ladies and gentlemen and small people, can I introduce to you the great songmaker from War Horse, John Tams.
I think Canada is held in your heart in a very special way, Michael.
Yes, it is. I'm sort of Canadian. I'm claiming that at the moment because my daddy was Canadian. It's a rather bizarre story, but I'll tell you it because he's a wonderful man and a wonderful actor. What happened was that I was born in 1943. I know I don't look it, but I was born in and grew up just post-war. Sadly, the war it killed people and it wrecked lives and homes and buildings, but it also destroyed families, and my particular family was burst asunder by it, as many were, because my parents became divorced quite soon after the war for all sorts of reasons which happen when people are parted. Anyway, the result of this was that my father, who was called Tony Van Bridge, he'd like that. Anyway, bless his heart, he'd like that. Tony Van Bridge decided in 1947, when he came back, having tried to get my mother to come back to his side and failed. It was very sweet. He took her on a cycling holiday in Suffolk to see if he could rekindle the light of their love, and he couldn't. So he departed, and I was brought up by a stepfather called Morpurgo, which is why I have this rather strange name. My actual name is Michael Andrew Bridge Morpurgo. but Morpurgo is not my real name. Bridge is my real name. So my brother Peter and I were brought up in this home, a split home. And in those days, some of you older people here may remember this. If you were brought up in a divorced family, it was a thing of great shame. And so what people very often did was cover it up, and it was covered up completely in my household. So that when people came to stay, we were just this one Morpurgo family, and no one talked about my father who wasn't there. And I didn't know anything about him at all. He was just erased, really, from the family memory completely. And I know my brother and I used to pester my mother occasionally to talk about him, and it never worked. And he just sort of ceased to exist. And then one extraordinary evening when I was 19, it was Easter time, and there was a CBC showing of an adaptation of Charles Dickens' novel of Great Expectations on the television. And it was at a time when everyone watched the same program, because there was only one program anyway. And everyone watched it. And so we were all gathered, and it was new, and it was black and white. And you turned on the television, and you young ones here wouldn't even know about this. But televisions took ages to warm up. And so it was even more exciting, none of this instant stuff, you know. Anyway, it would come on. And it came on, you know that lovely scene at the beginning of Great Expectations. I mean, it's in the great Lean film as well. But there's this wonderful, wonderful moment where Pip is going through the graveyard at the beginning of the story, and the wind is whipping these trees, and you're just terrified for this young boy. And we were watching, the whole family were watching, you know, my stepfather, step-aunts, everything was step, and they were all gathered around there. And this boy is walking through the graveyard, and suddenly, from up behind, this gravestone rears this hideous figure. And my mother is sitting right next door to him. Oh my God, Michael, that's your father. And this was the first time I had ever seen my father as a convict. And the step people left the room.
We got in last night, and Michael got up at 6 a.m. this morning and began his course of interviews that he's been doing with television and radio and journalists, but he was looking forward to this, and I can tell he's in danger of having a good time. So
we mustn't do that, must we?
No, we mustn't do that. You never knew what was going to happen 30 years ago nearly, didn't it, since you wrote Warhorse, that this would happen to it?
Not really. I mean, I wrote it in 1980, 81.
81, yeah.
And had no notion at all it would do this. No, you don't. When you write a book, when you write a story, you just write a story. And I wrote the story originally because I needed to write it. I think the best writing I've ever done, the best writing anyone's ever done, I think, is because you have to do it. You don't write to entertain people. You write because there's something you care about. And in this particular instance, I just got lucky. I moved down to this tiny village called Iddesleigh in Devon, in the west of England. And I moved there because my wife, Claire, who John knows very well, had decided that she would set up a charity called Farms for City Children, which would get kids from the big cities to come and live and work on a farm. And we went to one of the most remote places still in southern England, not remote like you have in Canada, but remote for England. And we ended up in this tiny, tiny place with 80 people living there, with a pub and a church, and that's about it. I mean, it was tiny, tiny. So we got to know the people very, very quickly. And for the first time in my life, instead of being a teacher moving from job to job, which I had been, we'd settled in this place, put down our roots very firmly, and started this charity and employed people and all the rest of it. And therefore got to know the people in the village very, very fast. And I discovered quite soon there were 3 octogenarians. Do you know what an octogenarian is? No, well then say so. Don't just sit there like a lemon, put your hand up and say, for goodness sake, what's sake? An octogenarian, okay? For those of you who don't know, there are 1 or 2 in the audience here. These are people beyond the age of about 80. You will get there, don't smile. Anyway, there were 3 of these old people living in the village. And it became evident to me quite soon that two of them had been to the First World War as soldiers. And the other one had been around at the time of the First World War. And I happened to go to the pub one day, as you do, and there was this old bloke sitting there nursing a pint. And so I sat down and we just got engaged in conversation, and I said, "How old were you when you went to the First World War?" He said, 17. I asked him his regiment, asked him where he went, and then I stopped asking questions because he seemed very, very willing to talk. A man called Wilf Ellis. And I knew him really because he was now an antique dealer. And he sold me a picture of a horse. My wife loves horses, and I bought for her birthday a picture of a horse called Topthorn. And I bought it, and it's treasured in our kitchen still. And those of you who know the book will know that the name comes in the book. Anyway, this old man was sitting in the pub, this old antique dealer, talking to me about the war and telling me things I'd never read in the great war poets, I never read in the history books. I was hearing it from someone who'd been there. And I felt it was a really extraordinary moment, a very privileged moment for me, because he was telling me things his wife later told me that he'd never told anyone else at all. I think it's because he didn't know me, bizarrely. And he was just talking. And he was telling me about how everyone was scared, rigid, never talked about it, how he got gassed, and he was shot in the foot, and he found himself at the bottom of a trench, unable to move because he'd been shot in the foot, and a German soldier jumped down the trench, and he had a bayonet pointing at his neck, and the German soldier just walked off, didn't kill him. And his wife now says, his widow I should say, who was about 95, 96, she told me the other day, she said, well, he was such a scrappy looking thing, he wasn't worth the killing, was he? And anyway, Wilf survived and told his story, and I was so moved and touched by the fact that he'd done that, I went back home and I took out this picture, which we'd had for some time but didn't want to have around much because it was, for the children in our family, it was a bit horrific. It was a picture of horses in the First World War, British cavalry charging up a snowy hillside into a defended position. There was a wood and German soldiers shooting down on this cavalry charge. And the terrible thing about the picture, which is why we hid it away, is that there was barbed wire and the horses were charging into the wire and being caught up. And you didn't want to look at it. The men were dying on the wire, the horses were dying on the wire. And it was a contemporary picture, it was painted in 1916. And I took it out again after I'd met Wilf and talked to him. And what occurred to me as I was watching the picture, looking at the picture, was that this man, for him it wasn't just a picture. These were the kind of scenes that he saw, the kind of place that he lived in this terrible, terrible time, as so many people did. And I thought then that I might write a story about the First World War. I hadn't got a clue what to do. I knew, like we all do, the great books about the First World War, All Quiet on the Western Front. I'd read all that. I'd seen Oh, What a Lovely War. All these things were rattling around in my head. I knew some of the songs because of Oh, What a Lovely War. But that was my take on the First World War. And then I thought, well, no, I want to find out something else. I want to find out about those horses. So I rang up the Imperial War Museum in London and I said, how many horses went from our side to the battlefields? And the reply came over the phone, we think about 1 million. And I said, and how many came back? And I said, 65,000. So I then worked out in my mind, it's not that difficult, that was roughly the same number of deaths of horses as deaths of soldiers on the British side. And I knew perfectly well that in the whole of the First World War, roughly 10 million soldiers had died on all sides, probably more. So it was roughly 1 horse for 1 man. So 10 million horses perished, and when they perished in that war, they perished in the same way the men did. They died on the wire, they drowned in the mud, they were machine gunned, they were blown to bits, they died of exhaustion, of disease. They shared the same horrors as the men shared. And it just got me thinking. It got me, I suppose, a bit angry. And then I remembered that another of these octogenarians, what's an octogenarian? Thank you. Living down the road, had been a soldier as well. So I went to see him, and it turned out he'd been with the cavalry. And he'd been to the First World War with horses, as he said. And he started telling me about it. He wasn't so readily able to speak. He was a kind of much more conservative man, sort of wrapped up in himself. But he did break in the end, and his eyes filled with tears when he said that his horse was his best friend, and that he could say things to his horse at night when he was feeding his horse that he could never say to his chums, about his longing for home and his terror of dying the next day and all the dreadful things that he'd seen. He could talk to his horse because the horse didn't judge, the horse didn't mock. And I knew then I was going to write this story. I had to write this story. Still didn't know how to do it. And then the last thing that really got me going was this. I knew I had to tell the story, not from a British side or a Canadian side or a French side or a German side or a Belgian side. I wanted to tell the story of the First World War as it maybe had not been told before, which was by a neutral observer. And I used a horse, I thought, as that neutral observer. I could look at the universal suffering, not just of that war, but of all wars. And so it occurred to me that if I could write it in the first person, I could be that horse, and I could leave this place where I live in Devon, be sold off as a cavalry horse, trained up as a cavalry horse, go across to France with the British Army, take part in a charge or two, be captured. This is all my storytelling going on in my head as I was thinking. Be captured by the Germans, used for pulling ambulances, used for pulling guns, wintering on a French farm. I get some sense of how that war was for everyone. But I knew I'd have to write it in the first person. And there's a problem with writing in the first person if you're a horse. And I mean, it's been done. There was a decent book called Black Beauty, which had, done it. But I didn't think I could go down there and get away with it. I thought it would sound sentimental, that young people reading it wouldn't buy into it. And then something happened which convinced me I could do it, and it was this. I mentioned just briefly these kids who came down to work on the farm. Well, they stayed in this big Victorian house on the farm, and on a Thursday evening after their week's work on the farm, I would go up and read to them on the last evening. I'd tell them a story, I'd read them a story. And I'd walk up on a November night, and I remember going up there, and it was drizzly one night, and there was a school inn, and I was going to read them a story. And I walked into the stable yard, and I saw there was a light on, and a horse's head sticking out over the stable. And this little kid was standing there under the horse's head. And I recognized him. He's a boy called Billy. And Billy, I knew had a problem. The teachers had warned me right at the beginning of the week, Michael, you are really used to pointing at people and asking them questions, and it makes children fearful. Billy is a nervous child. Please don't do it to him. He's nervous. We know he is. He's got all sorts of problems, fostered several times over. He's only been with us 2 years, and he hasn't spoken a single word the whole time he's been in school. We think from his previous school reports he has a terrible stammer or stutter, and he won't speak. So don't point your finger at him and ask him questions, because you just get terrified. So I'd been a good boy, and I hadn't done that. And I'd been nice to him and kept my distance. And I'd watched him all week, and he was wonderful with the animals, very intuitive and spontaneous, but never said a word to them or to the other kids. So I walk in the yard, and there's Billy talking, 19 to the dozen to this horse, the words simply flowing out of him. So I ran down through the darkened vegetable garden, got the teachers. I said, you've got to come and see this. Billy's talking. So he came round, and we stood there in the darkness. And Billy was telling this horse all about his day on the farm. And we just listened. And the extraordinary thing that happened, which changed my mind, was that I knew that the horse was listening. That was the miracle. It was wonderful enough that this child was unlocked, that his confidence was growing, that he felt no sense of threat. He just felt companionship for this horse, and that's why he could do it. But what was wonderful was this horse, I sensed, knew that it was important that she stood there and listened. And then I'm thinking, hang on, this is a sentient, intelligent creature, not intelligent like I'm intelligent, maybe more so, maybe feeling deeply just as we feel. And so I thought, you can go back home and write this. So in a way, it was that moment of revelation that, in fact, it isn't sentimental. It's emotional, but it's not sentimental. Why am I wittering on like this, John? Why have you just set me on this train and let me go? I'm going to have a tangerine if you don't stop.
Oh, go on. Do that. Did you ever think you could convert into a play? You could make a play out of the novel?
No, I didn't, and this is why I thought it was absurd, because the novel sat around and no one bought it for, 25 years? No, it's true. It failed to win a prize, nearly won a prize, but didn't, and you know what it's like coming second, no one cares. So the book didn't sell, and then there was the National Theatre of London, a man called Tom Morris, got in touch, because he'd been looking for some way of using these brilliant puppeteers, handspring puppets. And he wanted to bring them somehow to the big stage, at the Olivia stage, at the National, and have a project in which an animal could be center stage. And he'd been looking and looking, couldn't find anything at all. I think he'd pretty well given up, and he went home for Christmas. Listen to this, it's about obedience, you children, listen. And his mother, Tom's mother, said to him, "Tom, haven't you been looking for a story with an animal at its heart?" Tom said, "Yes." "Well, I found one. It's called Warhorse, and you should read it." Now, Tom, who's a sort of big director at the National Theatre, said, "Yes, Mum," and read it. And 2 weeks later, I got the phone call that they intended to do it, my story, with puppets. I don't know if in Canada do you have pantomimes here? You don't really. You're really not a civilized country at all, are you? Anyway, pantomimes, which are usually utterly revolting. One of the conventions of them is you have to have a horse with 3 people in it and sort of covered in a cloth and everyone behaving in a ridiculous manner. And they're simply an object of fun. And this great theatre was going to put pantomime horses on the stage at the National and tell a story about the First World War. Well, you can imagine my feelings. But then I discovered, of course, they weren't pantomime horses and that they were doing something remarkable. And I went up to the National and I met Tom Morris and also saw a video, extraordinary video, of the work of handspring puppets. It was of a giraffe, black and white little film, walking across a workshop floor. And I just couldn't believe my eyes, because this giraffe, and you could see the puppeteers, but they weren't puppeteers, they were a giraffe. They were just the spirit, living, breathing spirit of giraffe. And it was so moving to watch this utter lack of ego in these puppeteers. They'd simply become this creature. And I thought, my goodness, if you can do it with a flaming giraffe, you can do it with a horse. Which is clearly what Tom Morris had thought, otherwise he wouldn't have got me up there. Anyway, 2 years later, we have a play. And not just any old play, one of the great theatrical events and innovations, I think, that we've seen in the UK. And now it's in Canada with a great Canadian cast whom I'm about to meet tomorrow. John did the song making and Adrian Sutton did the music, and what happened in front of my eyes over a period of 2 years was the most extraordinary joining together of really people with the great geniuses of theatre, each in their own way. Ray Smith did the amazing artwork, extraordinary lighting, the direction was just wonderful, and bit by bit this extraordinary production came together. And I was there on the first night, and 1,000 people got up, those that could stand because they'd been crying so much, and they cheered the place down, and I suddenly knew that there was this extraordinary event that had happened. And although it's part of my book in a small way, what I felt that night was that they'd taken this to such they'd widened the audience of this thing, because this was a children's book. I have the greatest respect for children. I've worked with them all my life. But what this production had done is to include not just children, but grown-up children. And that means that when you go to the theatre, it's full of kids of 10, 11, 17, 18, parents, grandparents, each of them bringing their own lives to this story. And because it's told so intelligently, beautifully told, it seems to have a very broad appeal, much broader than the book ever had. And I'm glad to say the book has sold a little better too. It's quite nice.
How many languages is it in now? It was in 2, wasn't it?
It was in 2 early on, and it didn't last long in those either. And now it's 32. This is because the book has been rewritten by Spielberg.
It was always going to be, with no disrespect to the blessed Stephen, easier to make a film of it than it was a play, in some respects, in my opinion. And thinking of Toby and Merv and all the team, and I notice Alex Sims, who's directing over here, is here, and Dave's here. Some good friends in the crowd who've been attached to this project for a long time. But the funny thing about Toby and Merv's job in working with the puppets is they work towards their own invisibility. Because what happens when they get it right, and they always do, is you invisibilize the puppeteers. It's just a horse. It's a horse, and it breathes, it lives. It's a horse, it does horse things. And it's the most wonderful place to be around it. It's a privilege, certainly for both of us, I think we've both agreed, to be around those great sculptural pieces. Incidentally, we've got to go to Australia with it at some point, and the horses have to go into quarantine. They have to go into quarantine for 6 weeks when we go to Australia.
John, you're joking?
No, they do. Yeah, it's true. Because they're made of willow. They're made of wood. And the Australians are a bit nervous about importing little mites and things, so they have to go into quarantine for 6 weeks. I think it's a great photo opportunity.
You can't take wood into Australia?
Not with termites in it. No, you can't, Michael. No.
But who says they've got termites in it?
Well, we want them to have, because it's good picture opportunity. Kylie Minogue takes the apples to the horses. It's got to be the best photo shot.
Don't you think that in revenge we should quarantine their boomerangs when we bring them back? I mean,
How much input did you have in the script for the stage version that Nick Stafford wrote, and the script for the film version that Richard Curtis and Lee Hall wrote? Did you have any input?
I would say minimal. Not because I wasn't asked. The wonderful thing about both the National Theatre and Steven Spielberg is this, that they both treated the original concept with great respect. But here's the thing. I knew and they knew that I write stories on paper. I tell them down on paper. That's what I do. I'm not a dramatist, and I'm not a screenwriter. I tried to be a dramatist, and I haven't been very good at it. And I've tried to be a screenwriter, and I've been all right at it, but not great. And I think what they did was to give enough respect to the original story to show me the script and say, what do you think? And I would say what I thought. And I still say what I think. And they listen. But they only listen, I think, to the point at which they think it can help the dramatization of it. What they don't want this to be is a representation of the book on the stage or a representation of the book on the screen. Because that's where it all goes wrong. These are different creatures. I know that, and I have huge respect for what they do. When this started out, the National Theatre had previously done an adaptation of a wonderful book called His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and then another one of Coram Boy by Jamila Gavin, both extraordinary productions. And I rang both these authors up, and they're both my friends, and then said, what do I do? What do I do? Are these people any good at it? What do I do when the scripts come through? And both of them said, actually what you have to do, yes, you put in your 2 pennyworth, you hope they listen, but finally, you have to trust them. And I did that with both the play and the film, and it's been wonderful, and it was the right decision. You mustn't interfere. You must let people who have this wonderful talent have their head and do what they do. If it falls flat in its face, then that's just too bad. But I think late in life I realized that. When I was younger as a writer, I thought I could do anything. You're quite arrogant when you're young. Well, you're quite young. You know all about that. But you lose that arrogance as you get older, and you let other people get on with it, which is why I don't write songs. I let John do that. I won't even sing songs unless I'm really encouraged.
When you're probably aware of this, there were 14 Joeys in the movie altogether. 8 grown-up ones, 2 foals, and 4 colts. And they all had to look the same. I was down with Michael in a place called Castle Combe, which is the most beautiful village. It's supposed to be the most beautiful village in England. It's so beautiful it looks like a film set. It looks as though someone's built it, which is a bit unfortunate, but it actually is rather beautiful. And the horses have a makeup trailer of their own and their own makeup team, because they all have to look the same, and they've all got to have white socks, 4 white socks, and the famous flash on Joey's forehead, which was a toupee made of yak hair. So they were made up every day, and some of the horses did. 2 of them would stand very quietly and just be beautiful and just not move, and 2 more would fall. 2 could plough, and 2 did other odds and ends, like window cleaning and things like that. But Stephen had 4. The day I was there were 1,000 people on the set, and it was like this. It's very calm. He doesn't shout. He's got his little boy sitting on his knee, and he refers to him and checks out. He's watching the monitor. It was a delight to be on the set. And Michael's in the film, and his beautiful Claire is in the film. And I wrote loads of songs for it, and none of them are in the film. But that's Hollywood. In fact, I was talking to Richard Curtis, and there was a beautiful Catholic boy coming out of an Anglican church, high Anglican church, singing a non-conformist hymn, the one I've just sung, which is a kind of anthem. So it was a lovely Irish Dubliner Catholic boy, Anglican church, non-conformist, Baptist sort of radical hymn. I said, well, is that all right with you? To Richard, because I couldn't get to Stephen, he was busy. Is that all right with you? And Richard says, do you want your song in the film? I said, yes. He said, well, shut up then. This is Hollywood. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't. And the song didn't make the film anyway. I think Richard must have had a word with Stephen. But I haven't seen it yet. Michael's seen it twice now. Michael's got several versions. Obviously there's the movie, there's the play, most celebrated play in the history of the National Theatre. Michael does a concert reading of the book with some music, which is a beautiful thing to witness, and he likes to read to people, and who doesn't like to be read to? It's a wonderful thing, and he happens to read most magnificently. There's a radio version of it that I adapted and directed with Bender Blethen and Bob Hoskins and Timothy Spall playing Joey. It was a good version. And in the early part of January, we're going to film an app. I didn't know what one of those was.
Do these little things down here, do you know what an app is?
They know what apps.
Of course they do. Yeah, quite right.
Good boys. So we're going to film an app for iPad, and there's even, I told him some months ago now, you know when you're successful when there's a fridge magnet with Warhorse on it. And a latte mug. I don't know what latte is.
What's been wonderful on the journey of Warhorse since the play came out, because seriously, before that, very few people had read it. Once the play was out there, the number of letters I get from people who have stories about grandfathers and great-uncles who had a horse out in France, who went across with a horse or whatever, from all over the world, these stories come. And some of them are extraordinary. As one I heard, only a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from someone who said that his great-uncle had been on the Western Front, not with a horse that had come from England, but had this best friend of a horse on the Western Front, had looked after it for the last 18 months of the war. And then, as you know, what happened at the end of the war was that many of the horses that survived, the British government in its wisdom decided it was too expensive for them to come home, because the price of horses wasn't that great because there was a glut on the market. So they sold them off by auction, and many of them were bought by French butchers and sold for meat. So after all that extraordinary courage going through that war and surviving, that's what happened. And this one guy knew that his horse had been sold and was distraught. Thought that was the end of it. And he was in, I don't know, in Doncaster, 10 years later, walking down the street, and this milk float comes along, and 2 horses pulling it, and one of them was his horse. I mean, it's utterly extraordinary how these stories keep coming up. And I know people, when I wrote the book, said, oh, it's a bit idealistic, it's got this sort of happy ending, and why do you want to put a glow at the end of a story? But, well, actually, good things do come out of bad. And you just hear these stories again and again. And thank you for your kind words. It keeps an old chap writing. Thank you very much.
Have you ever had a relationship, like a special relationship, like it was in the book, with a horse of your own?
No. Someone very wise said the other day, I was showing Michael this, it says, if you want a stable friendship, get a horse.
You wouldn't appear on stage with someone like this, would you? You really wouldn't. No, I'm not a horse. Sounds ridiculous, but I'm not a horse person. I think quite a lot of writers are like this. You stand outside and you look at other people. My wife adores horses. My daughter adores horses. They're both great riders, and I've watched the trust and the loyalty and the affection build up between them and their horses. I've never felt that. I know they're extraordinarily beautiful. I've worked with them a lot. I groom them, I've mucked them out. I worked with the kids who came to the farm a lot with them. But I've never been a proper horse person. I have always found that when you're on a horse, the first thing a horse is inclined to do with me is to throw me off. I just don't get on with horses. And it's a shame, because I'd love to be able to sit and say, I'm a great horse person, and I'm not. I just write about them. Did you have another question? Because that costs extra.
It's just very interesting because you write about the relationship so convincingly, and I took from it, because I'm a horse person myself, that it was written by someone who really understood what that bond is.
Oh, I'm sorry. But I think it's fair to say this, that when you see the theatre production, most of the people who become horses have not all their life been familiar with horses at all. Most of them have come to be a horse for the first time. And it's really interesting how wonderfully and sensitively they can simply become these creatures. Yes, they go and have a lot of training, they go and talk to people and listen to people who know horses. You can learn about it. You don't have to have ridden or be deep into it, I think, to have this kinds of sensitivity. Particularly actors, because actors, it seems to me, are wonderful at picking up feelings from other people, at empathizing with other people. That's what they're good at. And people, in that sense, are the same as horses. You can empathize with another sentient creature. They have got this antennae out there, actors. They're kind of scary sometimes, the way they can sort of pick up on things, which is why I never became one. Too difficult.
I think it does also engender the nature of the company that present these plays, this warhorse tour of the world, it would seem. The book itself, the play itself, engenders a spirit, a community spirit, a mutuality. And it's because of the animalism of a lot of it, about how the company have to work with these horses, which they don't treat as puppets, they're horses. And the 3 people who play the horse, the head, the heart, and the hind, become a horse. And there's 3 teams to each horse, because it's quite hard work, because they're not very heavy, the big puppets, for about 5 minutes. And then they're quite heavy. And then they're like carrying a car around after about a quarter of an hour. And it hurts a lot. But I think there's something magical about Michael's original novel that has permeated all the other things that's happened from it, and makes that sort of emotional charge, and that one up there. And it's something that the company, I've been working in the theatre for 40 years, and I've never known such the way that this book bonds people and the play bonds people together. It's somehow very special. You're going to have a great time. Come to see it. Come to see it, please.
What was your inspiration for the music for the play?
Why did you ask him a question? What's the point? You know? John, that wasn't a very good answer.
I was just thinking that it's such a long answer. I was trying to find a short version. There isn't one. What happened, it seems to me, at the turn of the century, is a bunch of people decided to go and collect folk songs, had some inkling that the world was going to end in this terrible Great War, and thankfully collected a lot of songs, which I then went off to learn about. And then comes the book, and then prior to that comes Joan Littlewood and theatre workshops, Oh What a Lovely War. So it was negative inspiration, because I didn't want to go to Oh What a Lovely War and Goodbye and Here Comes a Whiz Bomb and things like that. I didn't want to go down that route, which was the Tin Pan Alley, Denmark Street route, because, for another reason you might find interesting, or not, is that they caught Tin Pan Alley off guard. It took them till about 1916 before they caught up with the songs. So there weren't any songs in 1914. The songs that were around in 1914 were the songs that other soldiers had brought back and taught to their children, like Dolly Gray, which is an American song. And like that one I sang at the beginning of the show, Only Remembered, which is an American song, but came back to Blighty and got used for lots of reasons. So my inspiration was to try and honour that community that was dedicated to the seasons of the year and worked when the sun came up, went to sleep when the sun went down, and dug things and grew things and made things, and to try and rather beautifully made songs that we could lift out of that so-called idyll. It was hard work, wasn't really an idyll, but pastoral, could lift and take them to France and drop them into the mud and the gas and the wire and the blood and see if they were still beautiful. So that's what I wanted to do. Really.
I was wondering, how long did it take you to make your book?
That's a good question.
I think roughly, it's very, very difficult because it was a long time ago. I think a long, long time to dream it up. I spent a long time dreaming my stories up, reading about them, talking to people. I think I maybe took about a year. And then the actual writing, I'm very quick when I write. Once I was advised by a really great writer once. And it's a bit of advice I can give you, and I'm not a great writer. I can tell a story. This guy was a great writer. He's a man called Ted Hughes. And Ted Hughes said to me one day, because he was a neighbor of mine, and I was having difficulty writing. And he said to me, what you must never ever do is sit in front of a blank piece of paper and worry about it. Don't look at the blank piece of paper until you've done weeks and months of dream time. You've really dreamt it up in your head. And with Warhorse, I must have spent certainly a year listening to that advice, learning all about the places the story is to be set, the people who are going to go, not so that I know what's going to happen, but so that I'm lost in the story completely. And then you can go to your blank piece of paper and do what I do, which is to tell it very fast. I learned, because I hated writing as a child, I found it really difficult to do. Used to get bad marks for it, and the more times you get bad marks, the worse you get at it. And I was put off it for a very, very long time, until Ted Hughes said to me, writing is about making music. You make music with words. You have to love the words that you use and speak the words. Don't just write them, speak them from your head, down your arm, through your fingers, onto the page, so that you are telling it down. And as you tell it, speak it, so that you can hear the music and the rhythm of the sentence. He said, if you do that, you forget about the punctuation, you forget about the spelling, all that happens later, that's another thing. But just tell it down, and then your story will flow. And I found that really works for me, and it takes away the anxiety of the thing. So when I write, in answer to your question, I write really fast. So I would say Warhorse took about a year to write, to prepare in my head, to dream up, and then about just 2 or 3 months to write, right? Because it came out in a whole flow. Do you like writing yourself?
Yes.
A bit? Not
A
much.
lot.
A lot. So might you be a writer?
Probably.
What's your name, so I'll know when to look for your books in the bookshop?
Danielle.
Okay. I will look for it in about 3 years' time.
Just the last bit. I'd like to thank the team here because they've been terrific and very supportive all day to us. So all the crew and the team and everybody associated with the Panasonic Theatre has been a joy to work with, and we thank them most warmly. Do come and see the show. We thank the organisation for inviting us here, and we look forward to seeing you along. Have a good Christmas.
Some in the village, only a very few now, and fewer as each year goes by, remember Joey as he was. His story is written so that neither he, nor those who knew him, nor the war they lived and died in will be forgotten.
Who'll sing the anthems and who'll tell the story? Will the line hold? Will it scatter and run? Shall we at last be united in glory? Only remembered for what we have done. Only remembered. Only remembered. Come on, sing it. Only remembered. And again. Only remembered for what we have done. Shall we at last be united in glory? Only remembered for what we have done. Only remembered for what we have done. Michael Morpurgo, ladies and gentlemen.